middle of the first century AD, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Galatia, "You were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Galatians 5:13 and 14. Outside of what Christ did for us on the cross, I cannot think of a better example of this verse being lived out on a daily basis than the men and women who use their freedom as an opportunity to serve others by volunteering for military service. Going places most of us would never go, doing things most of us would never do, often at the risk and expense of their own lives so that the rest of us can enjoy the freedom and life that is available to us in this great country of ours. Tomorrow's Veterans Day, and so today we honor the men and women who have given of their freedom in order to defend ours, to protect our homes and our families and our way of life from those who would seek to destroy everything that we hold dear. If you're a veteran, would you please stand for a moment? We love you. We thank you for your service. We'd like to recognize you today. Would you stand? Let's give them a hand, please. What a wonderful and tangible example we have of sacrifice for others in our veterans who have freely chosen to live a life of service to their fellow man, much like Jesus, who, reaching the height of his popularity, followed almost everywhere he went by hordes of people who were anticipating his rise to power and an almost certain liberation for the Jewish people from their Roman oppressors. Jesus says something that we're so used to hearing today, we don't really give it a second thought, but just keep in mind, they were hearing it for the very first time. He said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Luke 9:23. The cross that Jesus was referring to was, of course, the Roman cross, which was not only an implement of the most horrific type of death, but it was also a symbol of profound shame to anyone who would have to endure it. It's hard, really, to give a modern-day equivalent to the cross of ancient Rome, because our modern-day executions are carried out so quickly and relatively humanely, if you can refer to an execution that way. And of course, we use methods like the electric chair or lethal injection and a few others to execute those condemned to die today. And yet, even when you consider the firing squad or hanging or the guillotine, those are still infinitely less barbaric forms of execution than the Roman cross, where the condemned would hang for hours, even days, being nailed to a wooden cross, often naked, in a highly visible public place until they eventually died from asphyxiation or cardiac rupture or sepsis or even predation from nearby animals. It was meant to be excruciatingly painful, slow, and a humiliating way to die. And in fact, it was the most gruesome execution imaginable. So you can understand how Jesus telling people that they would have to take up their own cross if they wanted to follow him, how that would have been quite confusing, right? You veterans, just imagine you're following your commander into battle, expecting a great victory, but then your leader says to you, "By the way, if you're going to come with me into battle, you have to tie your own noose first and then bring that hangman's rope with you, and then you can follow me." Wait, what? It's not surprising that Jesus, describing his own death and the need for his disciples to take up their means of death as well just in order to follow him, would be misunderstood, right? Because at that point, there was no precedent outside of the prophetic overtones of the Old Testament sacrifices. They didn't have the gospel written down the way we do. They didn't have a lifetime of growing up in church learning about these stories like we do. It's not surprising they didn't understand what following Jesus would actually look like in the first century. What is surprising is that 2,000 years later, after 2,000 years of church history, 2,000 years of having the New Testament, 2,000 years of hearing these stories, 2,000 years of the gospel being taught, what is surprising is that his disciples still largely don't understand what following him actually looks like. Of course, some do. But many of us, at least in our culture today, I don't think we get it. Even though we hear it over and over again, even though we wear crosses as jewelry, which is wonderful, by the way, and even though we talk about living sacrificially for Christ, as we should on the whole, often we just don't get it. Because look, Jesus didn't say, if anyone would come after me, let him be denied and endure his cross daily as needed. That's not what he said. But that's exactly the way we think about following Christ today. That we know at times we'll be denied by other people, and we know at times that we may have to endure the sufferings of the cross that are thrust upon us, but that's not what Jesus said. It's not even close to that. No, he said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. You understand, Jesus was not saying that there will be times as a disciple of Christ when you may have to endure the way of the cross. No, he said every single day you must choose to embrace the way of the cross. In other words, we don't wait for the cross to come to us. No, we pick it up every day and we take it with us. What does that look like? Luke gives us a very clear description. After Jesus' death and resurrection, the disciples finally got it, and once they got it, they start living it. And Luke describes it one particular time after they'd been arrested and beaten for preaching the gospel. He says, when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Acts 5:40 through 41. I wonder how many of us would be rejoicing to be counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. The word dishonor in that verse is the ancient Greek word adamazo, which can be translated as shame. In fact, if you read that verse in several other translations, the KJV, NKJV, the NASB, they all say that the apostles rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Hebrews 11:35, some were tortured, refusing to accept release. The people being tortured were refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. They refused to leave prison after being tortured because it was the highest honor for them to suffer shame and torture in prison for the sake of Christ. They were choosing to take up their crosses daily and actually follow Jesus. Do we even have a clue today what following him actually looks like? In our pampered, self-entitled culture, church culture, we get so easily offended. We get so incensed by anything that even embarrasses us today. I'm asking, what would you do if you were actually put to shame by someone else because of your stand for Christ? What would you do if someone actually struck you because of your testimony of what Jesus has done in your life? I know what some of you would do. Would you stand up for yourself? Would you fight back? Or would you rejoice? Would you praise Jesus for allowing you the opportunity and the high honor of suffering embarrassment and shame and real pain for the sake of the gospel? Because that's what they did. By the way, they did it with tremendous courage and great compassion, as we'll see in our story today as we continue our sermon series, working our way through the gospel according to Mark, where Jesus demonstrates for these early disciples what your life actually looks like. What it actually looks like from day to day when you pick up your own cross and carry it with you. You take it with you to work, to school, to church, to the market, to your neighbors, everywhere you go. That's not a comfortable way to live, having to deny yourself and die to yourself, die to your own pride, die to your own desires, die to your own entitlement, die to your own rights, die to your own preferences. And instead embracing the way of the cross, you live a life of self-denial, laying everything down for Jesus Christ and his people. That's not an easy way to live. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and compassion, yet the hard truth is the vast majority of people are not at all willing to live that way today, even though Jesus plainly says that if you don't live that way, you can't follow me. I'm just not sure most people today, most professing Christians even understand fully what following Jesus looks like. Thank God for his grace and mercy. I'm saying that for myself because sometimes I just don't get it. It's exactly why Jesus shows us what it looks like in this story, because we must move beyond simply saying that we believe in the way of the cross. We have to actually start embracing the way of the cross for ourselves. So let's pick the story back up where we left off last time at Mark chapter 10. We'll begin by reading verses 32 and 33. Mark 10, 32 and 33. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." If you were here 2 sermons ago, you'll remember that Jesus had left the towns and villages in and around Galilee where he'd been ministering and was heading south toward Jerusalem and ultimately the cross. As foretold by the prophet 800 years earlier, Isaiah, in his prophecy concerning the Christ, where in chapter 50 he says, "I have set my face like a flint," meaning I have turned my gaze toward Jerusalem and the cross, which Luke also confirms in his own account of the same story when he says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, Luke 9:51. And so here Jesus is continuing that journey on the road, going up to Jerusalem, even though they've been heading south. Mark says they're going up because Jerusalem was 3,500 feet higher in elevation than Jericho, where they'll end up in this chapter. So it was common at the time to talk about going up to Jerusalem, because regardless of the direction, you're actually traveling. The road to Jerusalem, and consequently the road to the cross, was uphill all the way, literally, and of course figuratively. And when Mark says Jesus was walking ahead of them, which at first at glance seems like a rather random and somewhat insignificant detail, until you read his next statement, "And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid." Amazed and afraid. Why? Because Jesus was a wanted man. The religious authorities had made it abundantly clear how they felt about Jesus as he continually stood up to them, doing the work of the gospel, even though they'd accused him of blaspheming God, accused him of associating with people who weren't good enough to be in their religious club, accused him of being demon-possessed, accused him of breaking God's law, and constantly trying to entrap him in religious arguments in order to justify destroying him. Jesus was a wanted man. And everyone knew it, especially his disciples, who not only witnessed the aggression of the religious authorities toward him firsthand, but who had also repeatedly heard from his own mouth that he was going to be killed. And of course, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to know that the headquarters of the people who wanted Jesus dead was Jerusalem, the very place he had set his face like a flint toward, the very place he was walking to in this story with great resolve. Right? It's one thing to tell your friends while you're living and working in and around Galilee that at some point in the future, the people in Jerusalem are going to kill you. It's something entirely different to actually and intentionally start walking straight toward Jerusalem, where those same men who want to kill you are waiting. And just in case that wasn't enough to scare the living daylights out of his disciples, Jesus reminds them, "I want you to come with me. And oh, by the way, you'll need to bring your own cross with you." BYOC. We'll see in the next part of the story, Jesus assures them again that they will suffer the same fate for following him. In other words, the bell tolls, not just for me, but for you as well. Is it any wonder they were not only shaking in their sandals, but amazed at the resolve of Jesus, knowing the unspeakable horror that he was walking toward, and yet here he is, not just walking there, but leading the way. This is an aspect of the life of Christ that we don't often talk about, but we should, because embracing the way of the cross means embracing a life that will necessitate tremendous courage. Even when you're full of fear, because listen, courage is not the absence of fear. You know that, right? Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what we do in the face of fear. God knows we'll be fearful at times. He's the one who created us with the capacity to know fear in the first place. So it's not the absence of fear that makes us courageous, just like it's not the absence of weakness that makes us strong. The Apostle Paul said, "I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities." I have forever had a hard time getting my mind around this verse. "For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. It just goes against every fiber in my American being. Understand, strength and courage are choices we make when we feel weak and afraid. These disciples were scared out of their wits, and yet they were in lockstep with Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. This is the very picture of what it looks like to embrace the way of the cross with tremendous courage, even in the face of great fear. And look, I know we don't necessarily walk around thinking that we lack courage in our Christian lives today, but there's an easy way to tell. Just ask yourself, when was the last time I had to exercise real courage to do something for Christ? And of course, the answer isn't the same for everyone, right? To go to church, on Sunday in this country, particularly this part of the country, it requires no courage at all, because going to church in the Southeast is still culturally acceptable. But look, going to church in some parts of the world can get you killed, right? Just going to church in some parts of the world requires tremendous courage. It's different for everyone. A friend of mine posted on Facebook, there's an incredible underground revival in Iran. There's a pastor that quoted this. Here's a quote from an article and an Iranian believer. So he's quoting now from the article. The only church in the book of Revelation not critiqued by Jesus was under persecution and suffering. And then the Iranian believer said, if freedom is such a great thing for the kingdom, then why is Europe and America in the state they're in? An Iranian believer asks, when we walk outside, we don't really care if we get arrested. We're not upset if we get arrested. What is 50 years in prison compared to eternity with Jesus? For us, going to church costs us nothing. For some, it costs them everything. So, look, I don't know what it is for you that requires great courage, but I do know this. If you can't remember in your recent past when the last time was that you had to exercise real courage to do something for Christ, then you're probably not embracing the way of the cross that all disciples of Christ are commanded to embrace if you're going to actually follow Jesus. Because embracing the way of the cross will absolutely and often require you to exercise great courage in your life, even in the face of great fear. Without exception. There's no version of following Jesus that's easy or comfortable or safe or risk-free. There isn't. There's no version of living for Jesus, of embracing the way of the cross, where you get to be insulated your entire life from things like prejudice or derision or ridicule or rejection or abuse by other people because of your stand for Christ. And that isn't just standing for Christ in the world, by the way. I'd like to point that out. Sometimes we have to take a hard stand for Christ within the church, especially if you're a pastor. The Apostle Paul warned the church leaders in Ephesus, I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw the disciples after them. Acts 29 through 30. I'll just be honest with you. There's so much pressure today in the American church to accept ideologies and theologies, even attitudes about our culture and government and politics and the current trends. We're talking about things that are absolutely antithetical to the gospel. That as a pastor, I've actually found that I have to exercise courage within the church. Courage to stand for what is true according to the gospel, far more than I ever have to exercise courage in standing for the truth outside of the church. I have more trouble. I spent hours this week on the phone with people on every inch of the political spectrum upset with me. It just never ends, right? But I love the church desperately. It's very hurtful for me to have to hurt the feelings of my brothers and sisters, my church family. And I don't mean to imply that I'm always right, by the way. I'm often wrong. That's okay. Then my feelings need to be hurt. All right? And that's fine. And that's how we learn and grow. I'm talking about, though, when I have to bring correction to someone, I don't enjoy that at all. I don't enjoy preaching half these sermons, if I'm being honest with you, because I'm concerned that it's hurtful, but I know it has to be said. It's what speaking the truth does, not only in teaching the scriptures, but simply in dealing with people who are passionate about things that contradict the life and teachings of Christ. And so at times, I have to exercise, at least what is for me, a lot of courage to speak the truth, even though every fiber in my being wants to please people. because of my affection. I just love people, and I want to make everybody happy all the time. I am such a people pleaser. It's pathetic. And I have to fight that in my own life. I have to die to that in my own life and be willing to tell people the truth, even though I know it doesn't make them happy with me. I hate that, but I do it all the time. It's dying to myself. It's incredibly difficult to do, and it creates a lot of suffering internally for me. Some of you don't care. I admire some of you who just don't give a rip. You just tell people the way it is. I wish I could be that way. Look, the way of the cross says I have to speak the truth in love no matter how much it may hurt them or me. John Bunyan wrote in The Pilgrim's Progress, what God says is best, though all the men in the world are against it. Now look, maybe that's not the issue for you. Maybe it takes no courage at all for you to speak a hard truth to someone, even knowing how much it's going to hurt. You see, it's different for everyone. And so I don't know what the aspects of embracing the way of the cross make you fearful and consequently require great courage on your part. But I know this, if you haven't experienced whatever that is for you in a long time, you may not be as in lockstep with Jesus as you think you are. And I'm telling you, it's a question well worth asking yourself. I have to ask myself this all the time. When's the last time I had to exercise great courage for the sake of Christ and his gospel? Let's keep reading as Jesus continues to describe to his disciples what he's going to have to go through in order to embrace the way of the cross. Verses 34 through 45. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I'm baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If you were here for chapter 9, you'll remember that the disciples were having an ongoing discussion about who was the greatest among them, a discussion that it seemed at least Jesus had shut down when he picked up a child as an object lesson and said to his disciples, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all, Mark 9:35. And yet when incredulously, after explaining to the disciples the depth of suffering and shame that he would experience, they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. Right on the heels of that statement, we find out that the disciples are apparently still having that same conversation as James and John, the two who Jesus referred to as the sons of thunder, Boanerges in the Greek. Back in chapter 3, verse 17, they approached Jesus and asked him to grant their wish for one of them to sit at his right hand and the other at his left in his glory. Okay, according to Jewish custom, the first place of honor was to sit at the right hand of a ruler. It's in Psalm 110:1, 1 Kings 2:19. There are examples of that. And the second place of honor was to sit at the left. And in fact, this was even practiced by students who walked by their teacher, even applied to the angels, according to the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism. And I'll quote, it says, of 3 walking along, the teacher should walk in the middle, the greater of his disciples to his right, the smaller one at his left. And thus do we find that of the 3 angels who came to visit Abraham, Michael went in the middle, Gabriel at his right, and Raphael at his left. In other words, not only were James and John asking for the 2 most prestigious places in Jesus' kingdom, but every one of the other disciples knew it. And so Jesus says, look, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink or be baptized with my baptism? Which, of course, is a reference to the suffering and shame that he's about to experience, to which they reply, of course we are. And so Jesus says, well, that's good, because you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized in my baptism. James was the first apostle to be martyred. He was beheaded in Jerusalem while John lived out his life exiled on a remote island of Patmos but not before being boiled in a vat of oil in Rome. I'm not sure which is worse. And then Jesus explains to them yet again that they were missing the whole point of following him. So he repeats his teaching from chapter 9, but this time with even greater force. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. It's the Greek word diakonos. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all, which is something altogether different. It's the Greek word doulos. In other words, if you're going to be great, become a lowly servant to others. But if you want to be the best, become a slave of all, doulos. The last and least of all, like me, Jesus says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. By the way, in Semitic grammar, the many was a reference to utter totality. In other words, when Jesus says he came to give his life as a ransom for many, he was very clearly saying, I have come to give my life for all. You understand, this is what it looks like. Jesus says, if you want to get ahead in my kingdom, you must embrace the way of the cross, which means embracing the way of shame. Not just a servant, but a slave. And not just a slave, but a slave of all. The lowest posture among others that you could ever achieve. And of course, the early church was marked by the shame of following Christ. Remember Acts 5:40, when they'd called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and then let them go. To be beaten or scourged by order of the Sanhedrin was to be made a spectacle of by the most respected leaders in the community. First, you were stripped to the waist at a minimum, and then whipped with a triple strip of calf's hide, twice in the back and once on the chest, and then twice in the back and once on the chest, over and over and over and over and over again, not to exceed 40 times according to the law in Deuteronomy 25:3. It was such a brutal beating, the victims would inevitably cry out with each blow and even sob deeply from the unimaginable pain while others stood around and watched. Luke describes it as suffering shame, a depth of suffering and shame that we cannot hardly even imagine. And yet, what was their response? They rejoiced. They rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for the name of Jesus. English evangelist and author Leonard Ravenhill said the early church was married to poverty, prisons, and persecutions. Today, the church is married to prosperity, personality, and popularity. I'm not sure we have any idea what it means to embrace the way of the cross today. Bible scholar James Edwards compares disciples today with the disciples James and John then. He said, the brothers hope to honor Jesus while honoring themselves. How easily worship and discipleship are blended with self-interest. Or worse, self-interest is marked as worship and discipleship. You want to talk about convicting. Think about that statement for a moment. How easily worship and discipleship are blended with self-interest. Or worse, self-interest is masked as worship and discipleship. Think about that. Why do you come to church? Ministers, why do we come to church? Pastors, leaders, to be elevated or to elevate others? Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends, John 15:13. I have friends who, I love them. Every time they do something good for someone else, they take a picture and post it on Facebook. And then they'll add a caption, a comment to the effect of, I'm so humbled to be able to fill in the blank. Jesus said, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Matthew 6:3-4. When you think about your life, your dreams, your plans, your goals, do you see other people as a means to that end, an end that serves those dreams and plans and goals, or do you see them? Do you see them and the meeting of their own needs as your dreams and your plans and your goals? At the Last Supper, just before Jesus was to be hung on that cross, and he knew it, instead of looking to his friends to console and comfort him in his darkest hour, which anyone would understand, instead he got down on his knees and he washed their filthy feet. Shameful. And then he asked them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example that you also should do just as I've done to you. John 13, 12 through 15. Is that how you see other people? As an opportunity for you to be a slave to all? Or do you see them in light of your own self-interest? God help us if we use our status as Christ followers to lord over others, to create barriers between us and those who are not like us, to look down our noses at those who are less fortunate, less savvy, less successful, less clever, less appealing, less popular, less acceptable. God, forgive us for religious pretension that looks down on others when we should be looking up at them from our knees as we wash their filthy feet. And listen, if living that way seems shameful to you, then thank God you're finally getting the point. Embracing the way of the cross means embracing the shame of the cross. It means being a slave of all. Shameful indeed. Let's finish the story for today, verse 46 to the end of the chapter. And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way. Your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. He followed him on the way. The way to where? The way to the cross. Jesus is on the way to the cross. He's on the way to his own death. Bartimaeus, this blind beggar, could have easily been viewed by Jesus as nothing more than a nuisance, a distraction, an annoyance while he's trying to focus on the overwhelming task ahead of him. Jesus has already healed untold numbers of people, and now he's about to save the world. He certainly didn't have time for this blind guy. At least that's how others saw it as they tried to shut Bartimaeus up. But he would not be silenced, and Jesus would not be deterred from showing great compassion to this blind man. So he calls Bartimaeus to him, and he heals him, and then something interesting happens. As if the healing of a blind man isn't interesting enough in the story, Jesus says, go your way. Your faith has made you well. And immediately recovering his sight, he followed him on the way. Jesus told Bartimaeus to go your way. And so Bartimaeus follows Jesus on the way. The way to what? The way to the cross. You see, when Jesus told Bartimaeus to go his way, Bartimaeus obeyed. Because he was not only healed physically, he was also healed spiritually. When Jesus says to Bartimaeus, your faith has made you well, it's the Greek word sozo, which means to save. Jesus not only freed Bartimaeus from physical blindness, he freed him from spiritual blindness as well, which means Jesus' way, the way of the cross, had now become Bartimaeus' way. When Jesus said, go your way, that's exactly what Bartimaeus was doing by following Christ. And interestingly, in the 4th century apocryphal work, the Acts of Pilate, also known as the Gospel of Nicodemus, it's not biblical literature, but historical nonetheless. In chapter 6, verse 4, that book, Bartimaeus is recorded as appearing at Jesus' trial, along with others who had been healed by Jesus, as a personal witness on his behalf, just before Pilate condemns Jesus to death. And we don't know if that's accurate or not, but if it is true, then Bartimaeus certainly came to understand that the compassion he was shown by Jesus had to be returned in kind. And even without that story, we know from Mark that Bartimaeus became a follower of Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, which means at great risk to himself, he embraced the way of the cross. He embraced compassion. The compassion of Christ, not the compassion of the world, which is always conditional. As Bartimaeus knew all too well, as the crowds were trying to shut him up because his convictions were not the same as theirs. You see, the world will have compassion on you as long as your convictions are in line with the convictions of the popular culture. Yet the moment your convictions are perceived to be at odds with the culture, compassion from the world goes out the window, no matter your lot. On any other given day, Bartimaeus may have been ushered straight to the healing rabbi walking by, but this was Jesus, the one they all expected to liberate them from the Romans, the one who would cast off their oppressors' rule and give them their freedom back. And now he's on his way to Jerusalem to begin his political and military campaign as far as they were concerned, which means a blind beggar shouting for Jesus to stop and help him was nothing more than a distraction getting in the way of their agenda. But Jesus, his way, wasn't their way. Jesus' way was the way of the cross. And that same compassion that was driving him to the cross caused him to stop and heal this blind man. Okay, listen, Jesus will never call you to anything in this life that will prevent you from showing compassion to other people. You hear me? If whatever you're up to, no matter how spiritual it may be, if it doesn't include you showing compassion to other people all along the way, then it's not the way of Christ that you're following. If Jesus, on the most important journey this world has ever known, his own journey to the cross, if while on that profoundly important journey to save the world, Jesus took the time to stop and heal a poor, blind, socially awkward, loudmouth beggar, then there is nothing that you are up to in this life that is so important that you cannot show compassion to others along the way. In fact, compassion is the very essence of the way of the cross, because the cross is the ultimate example of compassion for an undeserving world. There's no way around it. If you cannot show compassion to your wife, to your husband, to your kids, to your parents, to your friends, to other people in the church, to complete strangers, if you cannot show compassion to people you really like and people you really don't like at all, if you cannot show compassion, then you cannot follow Christ, because the cross he hung on for you demands it. Is it easy? Is it comfortable? Is it self-gratifying? Not usually, because to embrace the way of the cross is to embrace the death of self. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, take up his own death daily, and follow me. That's not an easy way to live. Embracing the shame of the cross, dying to yourself, takes a tremendous amount of courage and compassion, and yet the vast majority of people refuse to live that way, even though Jesus plainly says, if you don't live that way, you cannot follow me. If anyone would come after me, if you're going to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The cross is the only thing you can take with you. So when's the last time you denied yourself to the point you had to exercise real courage just to do what Jesus was calling you to do? When's the last time you denied yourself to the point that following him meant embracing the shame of the cross? When's the last time you denied yourself to the point the supernatural compassion of Christ overwhelmed your natural desire to reject the need of another? Rich, I know the answer to that. Is when you understand that's what life looks like when you follow him, then you can't help but make those kinds of choices, even though it's not easy. And listen, a faith that does not lead to following is not a saving faith. Jesus never approached people in Scripture and said, hey, come believe in me. Hey, come pray this prayer with me and you'll be saved. No. What he said over and over and over and over and over and over and over again was, hey, you stranger, come follow me. The saving faith was something that came as they followed him. They didn't even know who he was in the beginning. They certainly didn't know he was the Messiah till much later, long after they'd been following him. That's not what saved them, you understand? But if you're not with Jesus, how can you know Jesus? If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Yet I wonder, do we even have a clue what following Jesus looks like? Because a saving faith in Christ is a following faith in Christ. It's the way you must embrace if you're going to truly follow him. It's not an easy way. It's not a proud way. Certainly not a self-gratifying way. In fact, it's uphill all the way. But it leads to a cross, and it leads to Jesus, who is there waiting for you to pick up that cross and follow him. Let's pray.